what I'm going to be talking about here so much. It's more about academia and indeed society in general. And I fully know that there are many people who are better at articulating these issues than I am, some of which we've heard through the course of these webinars. So what I want this to be is a little bit more inspirational, I guess, to get more people involved, and also the people that are already involved in discussing these issues, that they're not alone. So let's get started. So given the title of my talk, I think I'm going to start at a pretty obvious place, at European colonialism, because with the expansion of Europeans around the globe, and with European colonialism came the imposition of a certain way of looking at the world, at the expense of a variety of local and indigenous worldviews that were oppressed and at times erased. And this European, the imposition of this European way of thinking posed itself as one universal truth, the only true way of looking at the world, or as Walter Mignolo puts it, as a local European imaginary that poses as the universal. And this knowledge system, this way of looking at the world, this worldview, is based primarily, almost to the point of obsession, on categorization and division. So dividing between human and earth, or between man and woman, or dividing places by geography, etc., etc. And it's this ideology which is encompassed in the term coloniality. So the ideology of colonialism, it's this ideology that's produced the crises of the Anthropocene, which you can see in my slide is something that I've crossed out because I disagree with it purely on nomenclature, that it obfuscates the causality of the crises and also plays into sort of fascist ideas of human overpopulation. And another thing that colonialism, coloniality has done, has brought something that I've called here ontological famine, which is the denial of the opportunity or the possibility to imagine a present and a future outside the ideas of coloniality. And I think we'll get back to that a little bit further on. But at the sort of official legal end of colonialism, I guess in the 1960s, coloniality and ontological famine didn't end. Instead, they sort of evolved into sort of structures that characterize the world pretty much as we know it right now. And I'm going to be discussing two main structures here. Firstly, nationalism, which is a geography that is enclosing sort of an identity, a nationality. But it's also a geography of division, because identity is something that transcends geography. And this is something I think that was exhibited quite starkly earlier this year and continuing now in the protests that erupted around the world for Black Lives Matter. Because these were protests in solidarity, but also in recognition of shared experience and of shared identity of being Black or being a person of color in a diaspora. And nationality divides this, separates this shared identity. And next is development theory, which is an economic principle that emerged in the sort of post-colonial period in the 1960s, which prescribes a single pathway, a single trajectory of development that the global South, the colonized world, needs to follow in order to reach the level of development of global North, the colonizers. And this does multiple things, but two of the main things that it does is maintains a sort of subservience of the global South in terms of mandating that natural resources in these countries or in these areas need to be exploited and they need to be exported in order to achieve economic development and economic growth. But lifestyles in the global north, in Europe and the US, et cetera, are fundamentally dependent on the exploitation of resources in Africa and in Latin America and Asia, et cetera. And another thing that this does is, in combination with nationalism, creates a sort of competition between countries. So instead of working together, you tend to work against each other to sort of move up the ranks of development. And now I'd like to sort of carry this idea or this metaphor of nationality, of nationalism and economic development to universities, because they share many characteristics. So first of all, a university is, again, an enclosed entity with sort of metaphorical borders, with entry is restricted based, yes, on merit, on grades and etc. But especially as you move up the hierarchies in university, these selection criteria become increasingly gendered and increasingly racial. And secondly, there's a sort of emerging importance of rankings of universities, of, you know, who's better than the other. But this again does two things. So it creates this sort of competition between universities. And it also sort of makes a sort of single trajectory of development for a university. So we all want to be that kind of Oxford or Yale, etc. But universities need to play different roles in different regions, in different countries, depending on the needs of that region, not sort of fulfill a single goal. And another aspect is that I'm not entirely sure how one university can be better than another when there's so much collaboration, often unequal collaboration, but so much staff are educated at different institutions in different countries, and so much research is carried out in different areas, between different institutions and in different countries. So that doesn't quite sit well with me. So now we've sort of, well, I've introduced sort of two main concepts here, I guess. First is the ideology of coloniality, sort of the categorization and division as an issue. And secondly, more sort of structural issues, which are the sort of nationalism and the hierarchies and things like that, and the economics of it all. And one method to sort of deal with these or combat these issues is decolonization. And an important statement, I think, to make whenever you're talking about decolonization is to say that it is not a metaphor, which means that you cannot separate the theory of decolonization from the practice. And the practice is fundamentally to do with emancipation from coloniality. But what we've seen with some of these terms like decolonization, and we've seen with diversity, is that they get appropriated in certain ways and lose their meaning. So, and I think we're sort of seeing this with this year, even with anti-racism, where it becomes something more about personal development. Like, I need to read, I need to learn, and then once I do that, I can become non-racist or become an anti-racist, which, yes, is an important part, but obfuscates the sort of the message behind a lot of the protests, which was the dismantling of systemic racism, which goes beyond the action of any individual. So to avoid doing this with decolonization, it bears to keep in mind where decolonization comes from. And Gloria Becker here says that decolonization in the university is about giving away power. And I'd like to sort of play with this a little and say that rather it's about taking power, because decolonization comes from the liberation of Africa and other colonies. And it comes from roads must fall and fees must fall in South Africa and elsewhere. And so to avoid falling into the same traps of diversity and inclusion, it bears to keep in mind that decolonization is protest and opposition. And now to get into these oppositions of how decolonization can be applied, can be used, we can first deal with the sort of ideological aspects that we spoke about earlier. And firstly, we can sort of question the universality of some of the theories that we use in the context of how they emerge. So for instance, biodiversity, it's a sort of general assumption that more is better, which is quite possibly true, but is also a sort of very sort of capitalistic way of looking at it, that, you know, more is always better. Isn't it? Maybe, maybe not. And there's also some sort of problematic aspects with the sort of use of virgin and sort of unspoiled environments, with the idea that then humans, introduction of humans into an environment sort of introduces disturbance and destruction, which plays into this idea of a sort of structural divide between people and the environment. And then more specifically in the work that I do in palaeoecology, some of these indices that are used to infer the presence of humans in the environment that are fundamentally Eurocentric and have been used or contribute to the diminishing or erasure of the presence of indigenous peoples in the landscape in multiple regions of the world. And secondly, we can interrogate the structures by which it is only the contribution of white men historically that are remembered in the development of these theories. So for instance, Alexander von Humboldt, Charles Darwin, Alfred Wallace, etc., none of their work would have been possible without the contribution and collaboration of local guides and collaborators. But this work, this work is erased almost entirely. And sadly, this is something that persists in research conducted today to a large extent. And continuing with these oppositions, we can defy what we called earlier ontological famine by imagining different worldviews or including different worldviews. And one way of doing this is interdisciplinarity, which in environmental archaeology is already something that we do. We were almost there, because this sort of deconstructs this imagined divide between humans and the environment. And sort of almost imagines a different perspective, a different way of looking from the world, from the sort of traditional colonial view. And another way that we can do this is to make space for and to embrace the variety of indigenous knowledges, which often don't have this division or don't imagine this division. But this can also be quite a dangerous thing to do or a risky thing to do, because you risk a sort of commodification and extraction of these knowledges, like with so much that we've done of indigeneity and of indigenous lands. And thirdly or lastly, something I think that is essential to any effort towards decolonization is the adoption of intersectional feminisms, which emphasizes the relation between categories. And at this relation, at this interface, these categories cease to exist. So for instance, you can't be separately a biological human as part of nature and separately be a cultural human, someone who thinks. You can't do these things separately. Similarly, you can't be you can't simultaneously be a woman and a Black woman, because the definition of woman is a white European idea and does not fit with the characterizations made by indigenous peoples elsewhere. And something that intersectional feminisms also remind us very importantly, is that feminism is not really about gender. It's actually about the opposite of gender. It's about deconstructing and opposing the divisions that gender implies. And now moving more towards the structural issues that we have. So to defy the sort of manifestations of categorization in terms of discrimination based on a variety of factors. And because discrimination whether based on race or gender or perceived ability, because they're so institutionalized and so entrenched in society, any effort to deconstruct these needs to be very targeted. So it means committing to affirmative action. And this is very much something that we can lobby our governments and our institutions to do, but it's also something that we don't have to wait for, that we can do on our own. And all that takes is looking around your department and being like, ooh, it's awfully white around here. Or looking at a panel and asking, why is that all men? And they're doing something about it. And then we can also very simply defy nationalisms or the divisions that nationalisms create by pursuing collaborations across institutions, across countries, and between institutions and communities. But these collaborations need to be both ethical and emancipatory, and not, as they can often be, exploitative and extractive. And Dr. Camilla Speller pointed out a couple of weeks ago in her presentation as one of the questions that government's not usually very helpful in this sense. And I can say that it's the same is often true for universities and institutions, because it goes against this agenda of competition that you have. So you don't really want to be uplifting another institution in another country if you're in competition with that. So it's very important that we defy that. And lastly, we need to embrace our shared identity as environmental archaeologists or as environmentalists, as a group of people, a community that share a passion for people, for the environment, and for sustainability. And if we do this, then when in South Africa, for instance, when ethnobotanical research contributes to the sharing of profits from the rooibos tea industry with indigenous communities, and when local communities win the legal right to refuse the destruction of the land from mining, we get to collectively share in these victories. But simultaneously, when environmental activists like Fikile and Sangashe, who I did not know personally, but is or was a prominent environmental activist in a part of South Africa that I used to work in, when she and people like her are murdered for their work, we mourn that collectively, because frankly, she and others like her deserve better from all of us. So now, just conclude very briefly that academic practice, and indeed society, is built on extraction and exploitation. And it's only by opposing the structures and the ideologies of this exploitation that we can imagine and achieve any form of sustainable future or sustainable futures. So yes, thank you. Oh, just one more. So these are my references. And I've actually sort of put it together like a kind of reading list or watching list as well. And if anyone wants access to this or PDFs, or even just to have a chat about these things, my email is at the bottom of the slide, so feel free to get in contact. Thank you.